Hi everyone, this is part 2 of my short story Wrecker's Point. So if you haven't heard the first part, go back and listen to it, otherwise the story might not make sense. Anyway, enjoy. Bye!
The light was beginning to fade when Daniel finally got up from the deck where Angus had wrestled the knife from him. Duff was at the helm, and Angus watching the rods, which trembled and whistled as if they were living things. The boat was rising and falling ever so slightly. Daniel approached Angus and sat next to him. "I don't know what I was thinking," he sighed, and looked out over the sea. "Dan," said Angus, "we're getting further out, and these little waves are the dog before the master, you know? A storm's coming." Angus was holding the St. Andrew pendant in his hand. He pointed ahead. Daniel saw a faint glow. "We're too close. We need to head back." "I know." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go in." He yelled to Duff to bring the boat about and head for shore. Duff stuck his head out of the cabin. "Eh, lad? We're sitting in the water where the beast what took your son lives." He stepped out, wiping his brow as he did so. He pointed to the gulls in the sky. "See how they fly?" Daniel looked up. The gulls circled and wheeled in the sky, but sometimes they would cut their arc short and veer to the left or right, as if there were an invisible wall between the two flocks. "We're sitting over the Graph," said Duff, and suddenly the boat was surrounded by the indigo blue of the trench. Angus gave a cry and leapt to his feet. Duff gestured vaguely while taking a swig from his hip flask. There was a sound above the wind and sea. One of the ratchets on the starboard rod was screaming, and the tip was beginning to dip noticeably more than the others. Any further discussion was cut short. "Fish!" yelled Daniel, racing to the line and trying to lift it out of its stand. "We have a fish!" Duff hauled him out of the way and secured the rod around his waist. "Fish on, lads," he said, taking a final sip from his flask and looking at Daniel and Angus over his shoulder. And before Daniel knew it, the storm blew in, and they had a fish on the line. Angus looked at him, pleading at first, but then his expression hardened. He tucked away his St. Andrew and looked at the helm. Before he could make a move, however, the ship lurched. "She's rolling on the line," yelled Duff above the roaring wind and a sea that smashed against the gunwale and slopped over the transom. Wrecker's Point was a flickering star on the blackening horizon, continually flashing in and out of view as the boat plunged up and down in the swell. Daniel fancied he could hear the wood in the rod cracking as Duff wrestled with a fish that had bent it and Duff almost double. The handle rested on Duff's thigh as he braced himself, almost squatting. "It'll snap the damn line if it doesn't take us down," he heard Angus say. "Bring her up, Duff. Beaumont, help me get these other lines in. We don't want them to tangle as it comes aboard." Daniel struggled to see the lines, but he felt the weight of the sea drop off them as he brought them out of the water, his hands frozen and slipping on the reels. He laid the rods down with a clatter on the port side, while Angus carefully did the same starboard. "She's moving under the scaff. Out the way!" Duff crab walked around the cabin, up to the bow, and turned port side, shouldering Angus out the way as he did so. Angus stumbled. The boat dropped into the hollow valley of a passing wave, and he didn't recover his footing. Instead, he pitched forward and hit the deck hard, with a thud that was barely audible above the sea and wind. "Here she is!" screamed Duff. In the growing bioluminescence, Daniel could distinguish the blacker shades of blood that had begun to spread out from under Angus Reed, where he had fallen on a gaff hook. Ignoring the shouts of Duff, Daniel rolled his friend over. The hook had buried itself under Angus's ribs. A thin line of blood trickled out the corner of his mouth, left down his chin. He could see no first aid. Daniel dragged him into the boat's small cupboard was locked, while Duff struggled on with the fish. The sounds from outside how he knew the knives were but for the water that hit the cabin windows. Shaking the thought from his head, he pressed down around the wound. Angus was muttering something Daniel couldn't quite catch. Then outside, he heard Duff give a triumphant yell. He looked over his shoulder toward the cabin door, and then back to his friend's face. Angus was pale, eyes closed, and breathing ragged. Blood had seeped in a circle out from where he had been impaled, and his checkered shirt, with the rolled-up sleeves, was wet with blood, sweat, and ocean water. His hair was plastered to his skull, and he was fidgeting around for his mother's pendant. Daniel used his jacket as a makeshift tourniquet around the hook, turned away from Angus, and went back out. "She's too big to tie aboard. Tie her to the gunwale," Duff said between heavy breaths. He kicked a rope to Daniel and indicated the side of the boat. Gaff in one hand, rope in the other, Daniel peered over the side of the boat. The fish was big, almost the length of the 7-meter knuckleby. It was smooth and dark in the illuminated water. It flicked an asymmetrical tail fin out the water. Daniel took a step back. "But don't blether. Tie her off," said Duff. "Corpse for a corpse, did you not say? Tie her off." "It's a shark. A bloody shark," Daniel said. "Aye. Further north they eat them. She's tired, but so's my rod." The shark was not just long, it was thick, and the gaff could hardly fit round the tail. Daniel threw the rope over it with one hand. "Where's Reed?" Duff asked. He looked side to side, still straining against the shark. He made a move to grab Daniel. "Where's Reed?" The shark might have felt the slap on the rod, prompting one final twist and attempt to break free. The rope caught around its fins and raced through Daniel's hands, gashing them, and he was flung against the side of the boat. Duff grabbed him with one hand, managing to keep hold of the rod with the other, and dragged him to his feet. "What have you done to Reed?" he growled. A horrible smile started to spread across his face, a look of utmost glee. Daniel could smell his stale breath. It was years of tobacco and drink and fish. It made his stomach turn. The air was lit bright blue from beneath, and his palms burned in the salt spray as the rolling waves continued to smash against the boat. Then the water dropped, as if displaced, and the boat dropped too, leaving them in the air for a few seconds. The rod snapped, and Duff slammed into Daniel, knocking him overboard. The freezing water immediately took all the air from his lungs, and when he resurfaced, he could not take a breath. His chest was paralyzed, and he sank, fighting to stay afloat with a body that felt suddenly as if it was made of rock. Something struck his side, and he opened his eyes despite how much it hurt. In the blurry blue-lit world of the deep sea, he saw the shark. The bioluminescence of the trench below Daniel was bright enough for him to see that the shark had a stubby snout, no dorsal fin, and it was blind, its opaque eyes staring at nothing. It turned and rolled, trying to disentangle itself from the line and rope which was now cutting into its flesh. It was not interested in Daniel. Beneath the water, he heard a rumble and a deep, echoing howl, as of a whale. His whole body vibrated, and his ears pounded. He struggled to the surface and tried to get closer to the boat. The waves periodically submerged him under the water, and he gulped down mouthfuls of salt water as he gasped for air. "The trench takes, so that we may receive, lad," he heard Duff shout, as his head disappeared beneath the water. He resurfaced, grappling about himself, trying to reach the solid wood of the boat. His chest ached with the pressure of the shallow breaths he was taking and the weight of the water around him. "You were not born of our water," Duff was yelling, "and neither were—" He went under again. Daniel couldn't see the shark anymore. He heard the rumble and the howl again, and a crack far below, like the sound of huge cliffs collapsing in the water. And something was collapsing, displacing the water as it had done before, and sucking him further down. He was sinking into the trench. A huge stream of bubbles shot to the surface past him, and he scrabbled upward, willing his weakening legs to kick but the surface, obscured by the bioluminescence, appeared no closer, and his clothes assisted in dragging him down. He thought of Liam, drowned and torn apart and terrified like he was now. He thought of Wilma, drowning in her own way, and how he longed to reach her, to grab her hand, to build something new out of the wreckage of Liam's death. Perhaps they could start anew, on his home soil this time. And finally he thought of Angus, of his mother handing him the little St. Andrew, of his wife and child holed up in their house, though not free of the turmoil of the sea. He looked down as he sank into the depths. The fissure in the trench had grown. It was blacker than the darkest night, and little pinpricks of light, like cold white stars, shone within it, and the indigo blue of the bioluminescence surrounded it. From the darkness below, 5 further crevices opened up, and then raised themselves upward, and Daniel screamed beneath the cold, dark ocean. It wasn't a fissure. They weren't cracks. Something was reaching for him from the depths of the trench. Something with skin like ink, flecked with scales and barnacles, and a hand, webbed with transparent thin skin, the bones erupting from the tips like shining harpoons, immense in size, the hand itself bigger than even a whale. And then a hand grabbed his wrist, a tiny hand, and a small voice whispered in his ear, urging him upwards. A vision of St. Andrew sank before his eyes, and Daniel reached out and grabbed it, Angus's pendant. He heard the echoing howl again, and felt the water below him move counter to the current. But suddenly he was breaking the surface. His vision returned like pins and needles, and he coughed and spluttered as he was dragged to the boat. Not the Nuclavee. This was a different vessel. He recognized the voice of Hamish as he directed the others on board. Angus lay beside him, still breathing but not conscious. He looked like a corpse in the blue light. The howl tore through the ocean, and the waves began to bubble around them like a great boiling cauldron. Hamish had come alongside Duff's boat, and was now ordering an about turn. A few meters beside them, the shark was suddenly flung from the water. Its head crashed down onto the deck of the boat, sending splinters of wood to mix with the sea spray. Duff was still aboard his own vessel. He had been tied to the helm. Daniel could see the whites of his eyes as he watched Hamish's boat leave, and Daniel wondered with horror how long he had been in the water. Certainly no more than a few minutes. A spout of water shot up between the two boats, and in its wake, the Nuclavee rolled and capsized. And Daniel turned his face away from the trench to the lights of Wrecker's Point, and searched for the darkened window of his own home, where his wife lay in the turmoil of her own grief.